In the annals of Westeros, few names echo through history with such resonance as Lannister. From the mists of legend to the ashes of King's Landing, this golden dynasty has shaped the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. Their story spans millennia, from the cunning of Lan the Clever to the ambitions of Tywin, from the heights of royal power to the depths of familial destruction. Tonight, we trace the complete bloodline of the Lions of Casterly Rock, following their rise from trickster origins to their inevitable fall. Let the sound of gold coins and the roar of lions guide you into peaceful slumber as we unfold the entire Lannister legacy. In the twilight years of the Age of Heroes, when magic still flowed freely through the realm of Westeros and legendary figures walked among mortals, a single act of cunning would reshape the destiny of the Western Kingdoms forever. The massive fortress of Casterly Rock, carved from living stone and towering above the sunset sea, belonged to House Casterly, one of the most ancient and powerful families in the known world. Their golden halls echoed with the footsteps of generations. Their vaults overflowed with precious metals drawn from the deepest mines, and their banners flew proudly over a realm that seemed destined to endure for countless ages to come. Yet fate, as it so often does, had different plans in store for this mighty house. Into their world stepped a figure who would become legend. A trickster, whose very name would echo through the corridors of time long after empires had risen and fallen. Lan the Clever, as history would remember him, possessed neither armies nor treasures, neither noble blood nor ancient titles. What he possessed instead was something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable, a mind sharp enough to cut through the certainties of power and clever enough to turn strength into weakness with nothing more than words and wit. The tales of how Lan accomplished his impossible feat have been told and retold countless times, each generation adding their own embellishments to the story, until truth and legend became inseparably intertwined. Some chroniclers claim he crept into the rock through secret passages, using his knowledge of hidden ways to slip past guards and sentries like a ghost in the darkness. Once inside, these stories tell us, he proceeded to orchestrate a campaign of psychological warfare that would make grown warriors question their own shadows. According to these accounts, Lan began by moving through the castle's vast network of tunnels and chambers, making subtle changes that would unnerve the inhabitants. Gold would disappear from secured vaults, only to reappear in impossible locations. Locked doors would be found standing open with no explanation, and strange sounds would echo through the halls during the darkest hours of night. The Casterly family, proud and secure in their ancient fortress, found themselves jumping at shadows and questioning the loyalty of their own guards. Other versions of the legend paint an even more audacious picture of Lan's triumph. These tales speak of him appearing openly in the Great Hall of Casterly Rock, presenting himself as a harmless entertainer or traveling merchant. Through a combination of charm, misdirection, and carefully planted suggestions, he convinced the family that their fortress was cursed, that staying within its walls would bring nothing but doom and despair. So compelling were his arguments, so skillfully did he weave truth and fiction together, that the Casterlys themselves chose to abandon their ancestral home rather than face the supernatural threats he had conjured from thin air. Perhaps the most enduring version of the story suggests that Lan accomplished his victory through a more intimate form of deception. According to these chronicles, he seduced or befriended key members of the Casterly household, using their trust and affection to gain access to their most closely guarded secrets. Armed with knowledge of hidden weaknesses and family scandals, he systematically dismantled their confidence and authority until they could no longer maintain their grip on power. Whatever the exact method of his triumph, the results were undeniably spectacular. House Casterly, which had ruled the western reaches for generations beyond counting, simply vanished from the pages of history. Their gold, their fortress, their very identity passed into the hands of a man who had arrived with nothing more than his wits and his ambition. Lan the Clever took not only their wealth and position but their very name, transforming it into something entirely new. Thus was born House Lannister, a dynasty that would claim descent from this legendary trickster, while simultaneously rising to heights of power and influence that even Lan himself could never have imagined. The golden lion became their sigil, a fitting symbol for those who had gained their throne through cunning rather than conquest, through intelligence rather than inheritance. The words they would eventually choose, "Hear me roar," spoke to the transformation from clever trickster to mighty predator, from the hunter who relied on stealth to the king of beasts who announced his presence with pride. The early years following Land's conquest remained shrouded in mystery, the historical record fragmentary and unreliable. What seems certain is that the new House Lannister moved quickly to consolidate their unexpected victory, transforming their trickster's triumph into the foundation of lasting power. The wealth hidden within Casterly Rock's countless tunnels and chambers provided them with resources beyond the dreams of most noble houses, while the fortress itself offered security that few could match in all the known world. Under Land's descendants, the Westerlands began to take shape as a unified region under Lannister authority. The scattered mining operations that had made the Casterlys wealthy were expanded and organized, creating a network of gold and silver extraction that would fuel Lannister ambitions for millennia to come. Villages grew into towns, towns became cities, and throughout it all, the Golden Lion flew as a symbol of prosperity and order in the chaotic world of the Age of Heroes. The port city of Lannisport, destined to become one of the greatest harbors in all of Westeros, began as a modest fishing village blessed with an excellent natural harbor. Under Lannister patronage and protection, it grew rapidly into a center of trade and commerce that attracted merchants from across the narrow sea and beyond. Ships bearing the Golden Lion sailed to distant ports, carrying Westerland's gold and returning with exotic goods, rare spices, and valuable information about the wider world. As the Lannisters established their dominion over the western reaches, they faced the same challenges that confronted all emerging powers in that turbulent age. Neighboring kingdoms eyed their wealth with obvious envy, while ambitious lords within their own realm tested the strength of their rule through rebellion and defiance. Each challenge met and overcome only served to strengthen the Lannister position, proving that the descendants of Land the Clever had inherited more than just his cunning. The transformation of House Lannister from legendary tricksters to regional powers represented something unprecedented in the political landscape of Westeros. Where other great houses could trace their authority back through centuries of gradual accumulation, military conquest, or ancient bloodlines, the Lannisters had achieved their position through a single act of incredible audacity. This origin story would shape their character as a dynasty, marking them as innovators and opportunists who were always willing to take risks that more traditional houses would never dare contemplate. Yet even as they established themselves as the undisputed masters of the Westerlands, the Lannisters never forgot the lesson of their founding. Power gained through cleverness could just as easily be lost through complacency. And the descendants of Land the Clever understood that their position required constant vigilance and adaptation. The blood of the trickster flowed in their veins, reminding them that in a world where strength alone was rarely sufficient, intelligence and cunning remained their greatest weapons. The legacy of Land the Clever echoed through every subsequent generation of Lannisters, shaping their approach to politics, warfare, and diplomacy. They learned to value wit over valor, strategy over strength, and careful planning over reckless courage. These lessons would serve them well in the centuries to come, as they navigated the treacherous waters of Westerosi politics and gradually expanded their influence far beyond the borders of their western kingdom. The centuries that followed Land the Clever's legendary conquest witnessed the rise of a true dynasty, as his descendants transformed from cunning usurpers into legitimate rulers whose authority stretched across the entirety of the Westerlands. The Kings of the Rock, as they came to be known throughout the Seven Kingdoms, established a legacy of power and prosperity that would endure for thousands of years, building upon their ancestors' foundation of wealth and intelligence to create one of the most formidable kingdoms in all of Westeros. The early Lannister kings understood that their position, won through trickery rather than birthright, required constant validation through success and strength. Each generation faced the challenge of proving themselves worthy of the throne their ancestor had claimed through cunning alone. And each met that challenge through a combination of political acumen, military prowess, and the ever-present power of their golden treasury. The wealth that flowed from the mines beneath Casterly Rock provided them with advantages that few other kingdoms could match, allowing them to field larger armies, construct grander fortifications, and forge stronger alliances than their rivals. Among the most celebrated of these early monarchs was King Lorien I Lannister, known to history as Lorien the Liar for his mastery of deception and misdirection. Following in the footsteps of Lan the Clever, Lorien understood that in a world dominated by sword and shield, words could prove mightier than steel when wielded with sufficient skill. His reign marked a period of unprecedented expansion for the Lannister kingdom, as he employed a combination of diplomatic cunning and strategic marriages to bring neighboring territories under his dominion without the devastating costs of prolonged warfare. Lorien's greatest triumph came through his dealings with the Ironborn of the Iron Islands, whose constant raids had plagued the western coasts for generations. Rather than meeting force with force in a costly campaign that might drain his treasury and weaken his armies, Lorien chose a more subtle approach. Through a series of carefully orchestrated negotiations, false promises, and strategic bribes, he managed to turn the various Ironborn houses against each other, triggering a civil war that would occupy their attention for decades, while leaving the Westerlands free to prosper in peace. The reign of King Tommen I brought a different kind of glory to the Golden Throne, as this warrior king demonstrated that the descendants of the clever trickster could match any house in martial prowess when circumstances demanded it. Tommen's campaigns against the Reach established the Lannisters as a military power to be respected and feared, while his personal courage in battle inspired loyalty among his bannermen that would endure long after his death. His victory at the Battle of Red Lake became the stuff of legend, as he personally led a cavalry charge that shattered the assembled might of 3 rival houses and secured Lannister dominance over the disputed territories along their eastern border. Yet it was perhaps King Tommen II Lannister who would achieve the most lasting fame among the kings of the Rock, though his legacy would be built upon mystery rather than conquest. Fascinated by tales of the ancient Valyrian freehold and its dragon lords, Tommen too became convinced that the secrets of Valyrian power could be uncovered and claimed for the Westerlands. Against the advice of his counselors and the pleas of his family, he assembled a great expedition and sailed east across the narrow sea, determined to explore the ruins of old Valyria and unlock its ancient mysteries. The expedition that departed from Lannisport in the reign of Tommen II represented one of the most ambitious undertakings in the history of the Westerlands. Dozens of ships carried thousands of men, along with supplies, scholars, and craftsmen who were intended to establish a permanent Lannister presence in the east. The wealth invested in this venture was staggering, even by Lannister standards, representing years of accumulated gold and the finest equipment that money could buy. Yet for all its grandeur and ambition, the expedition simply vanished into the mists of history, never to return to the shores of Westeros. The disappearance of Tommen II and his entire fleet became one of the great mysteries of the age, spawning countless theories and legends about their ultimate fate. Some claimed they had discovered treasures beyond imagination and chosen to establish a new kingdom in the ruins of Valyria, while others suggested they had fallen victim to the same catastrophe that had destroyed the freehold itself. The most romantic tales spoke of Tommen finding love with a surviving Valyrian princess and founding a dynasty of dragon riders in distant lands, while the most pessimistic accounts simply assumed that the expedition had been lost to storms, pirates, or the countless other dangers that lurked in the waters around the smoking sea. Whatever the truth of Tommen II's fate, his disappearance marked a turning point in Lannister history, as his successors chose to focus their ambitions closer to home, rather than pursuing grand adventures in distant lands. The lesson of the lost expedition became part of Lannister lore, a reminder that even unlimited wealth could not guarantee success in endeavors that stretched beyond the bounds of wisdom and caution. The reign of King Gerald III Lannister brought the kingdom to perhaps its greatest height of power and prosperity during the era of the Kings of the Rock. Known as Gerald the Great for his achievements in both war and peace, he expanded Lannister territory to its greatest extent, while simultaneously fostering an age of cultural and economic growth that would be remembered for centuries. Under his rule, Lannisport grew into one of the greatest ports in the known world, rivaling even King's Landing and Old Town in wealth and importance. Gerald's military campaigns were marked by a strategic brilliance that combined the traditional Lannister cunning with an understanding of logistics and organization that was revolutionary for its time. Rather than relying solely on the bravery of individual knights or the shock of cavalry charges, he developed new tactics that maximized the advantages provided by his superior resources and equipment. His armies were the best fed, best armed, and best trained in Westeros, reflecting the kingdom's prosperity and the king's commitment to excellence in all things. The cultural flowering that occurred during Gerald's reign reflected the prosperity and confidence of a kingdom at its peak. The great sept of Casterly Rock was expanded and beautified with gold leaf and precious stones that caught the light of 1,000 candles, while the castle's halls were filled with works of art commissioned from the finest craftsmen in the known world. Bards and scholars flocked to the Lannister court, drawn by generous patronage and the opportunity to work in an environment where learning and creativity were valued and rewarded. Perhaps most significantly, it was during Gerald's reign that the Lannisters began to look beyond their own borders, with serious thoughts of expansion and conquest. The wealth accumulated over generations of careful stewardship had reached a point where the kingdom possessed resources that rivaled those of entire regions elsewhere in Westeros. This abundance of riches brought with it both opportunities and temptations. As the Lannister court began to seriously consider whether their destiny lay in ruling not just the Westerlands, but all of the Seven Kingdoms, the military strength that underpinned Lannister ambitions during this period was built upon a foundation of systematic organization and professional excellence that set their forces apart from the feudal levies that most kingdoms relied upon. The gold mines of Casterly Rock provided the resources necessary to maintain standing forces of professional soldiers who trained year-round rather than being called up only in times of crisis. These men were equipped with the finest armor and weapons that money could buy, creating an army that was both larger and more effective than any other force in Westeros. The Lannister fleet, based at Lannisport, represented another significant advantage in any potential conflict with rival kingdoms. Built with timber imported from the finest forests and equipped with the most advanced naval technology available, these warships could project Lannister power across the narrow sea and along the coasts of Westeros with devastating effect. The admirals who commanded these vessels were drawn from families with generations of seafaring experience, creating a naval tradition that combined practical knowledge with tactical innovation. The diplomatic advantages that accompanied Lannister wealth were perhaps even more significant than their military capabilities. The ability to offer substantial loans, trade concessions, and outright bribes gave the kings of the Rock influence in courts throughout Westeros and beyond. Ambitious lords found themselves drawn into the Lannister orbit by the promise of gold and advancement, while even rival kings sometimes found it expedient to seek Lannister support for their own endeavors. Yet even as the Lannisters reached the height of their independent power, the political landscape of Westeros was beginning to shift in ways that would ultimately challenge their autonomy. Reports reached Casterly Rock of a rising power in the east, where the Targaryen dynasty of Dragonstone was beginning to cast covetous eyes upon the fractured kingdoms of the mainland. The descendants of old Valyria possessed something that all the gold in the world could not buy: creatures of fire and magic that could reduce the mightiest fortress to ash and rubble in a matter of hours. The final years of independent Lannister rule were marked by a growing awareness that their era of splendid isolation was drawing to a close. Intelligence gathered by their extensive network of spies and merchants painted an increasingly clear picture of Targaryen preparations for conquest, while refugees from Dragonstone brought first-hand accounts of dragons growing larger and more fearsome with each passing year. The kings of the Rock found themselves facing a challenge that neither cunning nor wealth could easily overcome. As the age of Dragonfire approached the shores of Westeros, as the last of the independent Lannister kings contemplated their options, they could look back upon centuries of achievement and prosperity that had established their house as one of the great powers of the known world. From Lan the Clever's legendary theft of Casterly Rock, to the cultural and military triumphs of their greatest monarchs, the Lannisters had proven themselves worthy heirs to their ancestors' audacious legacy. Yet the approaching storm of conquest would test whether their traditions of cunning and adaptation could survive the transformative fire of Dragonflame. The year of Aegon's landing marked the end of an age and the beginning of a new chapter in the long history of House Lannister. As the descendants of Lann the Clever faced their greatest challenge since their ancestors' legendary conquest of Casterly Rock, King Loren I Lannister, the last of the independent kings of the Rock, understood that the approaching storm from Dragonstone represented a threat unlike any his forebears had encountered in centuries of warfare and diplomacy. The reports that reached his court painted a picture of devastation that challenged every assumption about the nature of power and the limits of mortal ambition. The tales brought by survivors from the eastern kingdoms spoke of cities reduced to ash in a matter of hours, of armies scattered like leaves before the hurricane winds created by dragon wings, and of ancient bloodlines extinguished in moments by creatures that seemed torn from the pages of legend rather than the reality of warfare. Harrenhal, the greatest fortress ever built by human hands, had been melted like a candle in dragonfire. Its massive towers twisted into grotesque shapes that served as a monument to the futility of resisting Targaryen power. The sight of this once mighty stronghold, reduced to a haunted ruin by forces beyond mortal comprehension, sent shockwaves throughout the remaining independent kingdoms. Yet Loren I was no ordinary king, and the blood of Lann the Clever flowed strong in his veins, bringing with it the cunning and adaptability that had served his house through centuries of challenge and triumph. Where other monarchs might have retreated behind their walls or fled to distant lands, the last king of the Rock chose to meet this unprecedented threat with the same combination of courage and calculation that had elevated his ancestors from clever tricksters to mighty rulers. He understood that the old ways of warfare had become obsolete overnight. But he also recognized that even dragons and their riders were not immune to the carefully applied principles of strategy and alliance. The first great test of Lannister cunning in this new age came through Loren's decision to forge an alliance with Mern Ninth's Gardener, the King of the Reach. This partnership between the two greatest remaining powers in western Westeros represented a calculation of desperate necessity, as both rulers understood that their only hope of survival lay in combining their strength against the common threat. The negotiations that brought these traditional rivals together required all of Loren's diplomatic skill, as centuries of border disputes and commercial competition had created deep wells of mistrust between their respective kingdoms. The alliance forged between the Lannisters and the Gardeners was more than a simple military pact, representing instead a fundamental reshaping of the political landscape of western Westeros. Trade agreements that had been negotiated separately for generations were consolidated into a single economic framework, while military commands were integrated to create a unified force that could operate with unprecedented coordination and efficiency. Marriage alliances were arranged to cement the partnership between the two houses, creating bonds of blood and honor that would survive even the coming catastrophe. Yet even as Loren worked to build the strongest possible coalition against the Targaryen threat, he understood that conventional military thinking would not be sufficient to overcome creatures that could rain fire from the sky. The lessons learned from the destruction of other kingdoms suggested that dragons were most vulnerable when they were on the ground, either resting or feeding, and that their riders could be targeted with sufficient preparation and the right combination of circumstances. These insights led to the development of new tactics and technologies designed specifically to counter the advantages provided by dragonfire and aerial mobility. The armies that gathered at the Field of Fire represented the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the Westerlands, as Loren called upon every available resource to meet the approaching threat. The professional soldiers who formed the core of his forces were supplemented by levies from every corner of his kingdom, while the wealth of Casterly Rock was freely spent to ensure that every man was equipped with the finest armor and weapons that gold could buy. The sight of this massive host, with banners stretching beyond the horizon and the golden lion of Lannister flying proudly at its head, inspired confidence in even the most pessimistic observers. The tactical preparations for the coming battle reflected both traditional Lannister strengths and desperate innovations designed to counter an enemy unlike any faced before. Massive ballistae were constructed and positioned to provide anti-dragon fire, while specially trained companies of archers were equipped with fire arrows designed to create confusion and panic among enemy forces. The cavalry, traditionally the decisive arm of any Lannister army, was reorganized into highly mobile units capable of rapid redeployment in response to aerial attacks, while the infantry was trained in new formations designed to minimize casualties from dragonfire. When the moment of truth finally arrived at the field of fire, the assembled might of the Westerlands and the Reach faced a test that would determine not just their immediate survival, but the entire future of independent rule in Westeros. The initial phases of the battle seemed to vindicate Loren's strategic preparations, as the coordinated attacks of his forces managed to ground one of the Targaryen dragons and inflict significant casualties on the invading army. For a brief moment, it appeared that mortal cunning and preparation might indeed prove superior to supernatural power and ancient magic. Yet the true horror of dragonfire had yet to be unleashed upon the field. And when Aegon the Conqueror finally committed his full power to the battle, the carefully laid plans of the allied armies crumbled like sand before a tsunami. The sight of 3 adult dragons attacking in perfect coordination created a spectacle of destruction that defied description, as thousands of soldiers were immolated in moments, and the very air itself seemed to catch fire. The screams of men and horses alike were drowned out by the roar of flames and the thunderous beating of dragon wings, while the stench of burning flesh filled the air for miles around the battlefield. In the face of this overwhelming devastation, King Loren I faced the most crucial decision in the long history of his house. The traditional response of Lannister kings, when confronted with superior force, had always been to retreat, regroup, and seek advantage through cunning rather than courage. Yet the scope of the defeat at the Field of Fire made it clear that no conventional military response could hope to challenge Targaryen supremacy. The choice before him was stark and unforgiving. Continue the fight and face certain extinction, or bend the knee and hope that submission might preserve something of his house's power and position. The decision to kneel before Aegon the Conqueror represented perhaps the greatest act of pragmatic wisdom in Lannister history, as Loren I chose survival and adaptation over pride and destruction. The ceremony of submission that took place in the aftermath of the Field of Fire was witnessed by thousands of survivors from both armies, creating a moment that would be remembered and retold for centuries to come. The sight of the proud King of the Rock bowing before the Targaryen conqueror marked the end of an era, but it also ensured that House Lannister would survive to see another dawn. Aegon's treatment of his defeated enemies revealed a political sophistication that matched his military prowess, as he understood that the complete destruction of existing power structures would create more problems than it solved. Rather than strip the Lannisters of their lands and titles, he chose to transform them into vassals whose wealth and expertise could serve the new unified kingdom he was creating. The appointment of Loren I, Warden of the West, represented both a pragmatic recognition of Lannister capabilities and a calculated gesture designed to encourage other defeated rulers to submit rather than fight to the death. The transition from independent monarchy to Targaryen vassalage required fundamental changes in every aspect of Lannister governance and identity. The ancient crown of the Kings of the Rock was surrendered to King's Landing, where it would be melted down and incorporated into the Iron Throne as a symbol of submission and unity. The royal court at Casterly Rock was reorganized to reflect the new reality of Targaryen supremacy, while ancient ceremonies and traditions were modified to acknowledge the authority of the Iron Throne over all previous claims to sovereignty. Yet even in submission, the Lannisters retained advantages that would serve them well in the new political order that was emerging under Targaryen rule. Their vast wealth remained intact, providing them with influence and leverage that few other houses could match, while their administrative expertise made them invaluable partners in the complex task of governing a unified kingdom. The experience gained through centuries of independent rule had taught them lessons about statecraft and diplomacy that would prove extremely valuable in the new world of court politics and royal favor. The early years of Targaryen rule brought both challenges and opportunities for House Lannister, as they navigated the complex transition from sovereign rulers to trusted vassals. The tribute demanded by the Iron Throne was substantial but manageable. Given the enormous wealth generated by their gold mines, while the military obligations of their new position were actually less burdensome than the constant warfare that had characterized the era of independent kingdoms. The reduction in military expenditure allowed for increased investment in economic development and infrastructure, leading to a period of prosperity that exceeded even the golden age of the Kings of the Rock. The integration of Lannister forces into the unified armies of the Seven Kingdoms brought unexpected benefits, as their professional soldiers and superior equipment quickly earned recognition and respect from their new comrades in arms. The tactical innovations developed during their final desperate campaign against the dragons proved valuable in conventional warfare, while their tradition of military excellence continued to attract the finest warriors from throughout the realm. Within a generation, Lannister officers were serving with distinction in campaigns across Westeros and beyond, carrying their house's reputation for competence and reliability to every corner of the known world. Perhaps most importantly, the Targaryen conquest had inadvertently provided House Lannister with access to opportunities that would have been impossible during the era of independent kingdoms. The unified realm created by Aegon and his successors offered new markets for Westerland's gold and goods, while the concentration of power at King's Landing created possibilities for influence and advancement that had never existed before. The wise investment of their wealth in relationships and alliances within the new royal court would prove to be one of the most successful long-term strategies in Lannister history. The transformation of House Lannister from independent rulers to Targaryen vassals represented more than a simple change of allegiance, marking instead a fundamental evolution in their approach to power and survival. The lessons learned from their submission at the Field of Fire would echo through subsequent generations, teaching them that adaptability and pragmatism were more valuable than pride and tradition when faced with overwhelming force. This wisdom would serve them well in the centuries to come, as they navigated the dangerous waters of royal court politics and gradually rebuilt their influence within the new order established by Dragonfire and conquest. The wheel of fortune that had carried House Lannister from the heights of independent kingship to the dignified position of Targaryen vassals would continue to turn through the centuries, bringing both triumph and disaster to the Golden Lions of Casterly Rock. After generations of wise leadership and careful stewardship that had maintained their position as one of the most powerful houses in the Seven Kingdoms, the family's fortunes began to shift during the reign of Lord Tytos Lannister, whose weakness and indecision would nearly destroy everything his ancestors had built through centuries of cunning and determination. Tytos Lannister inherited more than just lands and titles when he became Lord of Casterly Rock, receiving also the accumulated weight of expectations that came with bearing one of the most respected names in Westeros. His predecessors had established a tradition of strength and competence that stretched back through the ages, from the legendary cunning of Lan the Clever to the pragmatic wisdom of King Loren I, who had chosen survival over pride in the face of Dragonfire. Each generation had added to the Lannister legacy, building upon the foundation of wealth and intelligence that made their house a force to be respected and feared throughout the realm. Yet Tytos possessed neither the ruthless pragmatism of his forebears nor the natural authority that had characterized Lannister leadership for generations uncounted. Where his ancestors had ruled through a combination of fear and respect, carefully balancing the carrot and the stick to maintain order among their vassals, Tytos sought to govern through kindness and conciliation alone. This fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of power would prove to be his undoing, as the lords and knights who served House Lannister began to interpret his mercy as weakness and his generosity as foolishness. The first signs of trouble appeared early in Tytos's reign, when several minor lords began testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior through increasingly bold acts of defiance and disrespect. Where previous lords of Casterly Rock would have responded swiftly and decisively to such challenges, Tytos chose instead to overlook these transgressions in the hope that his forbearance would inspire loyalty and gratitude among his vassals. This miscalculation proved catastrophic, as each unpunished slight emboldened others to push the boundaries even further, creating a cascade of declining respect that soon affected every level of Lannister authority. The systematic erosion of Lannister prestige accelerated as word of Tytos's weakness spread beyond the Westerlands, attracting the attention of opportunistic lords throughout Westeros, who saw an opportunity to exploit the situation for their own benefit. Merchants began demanding more favorable terms for their contracts, knowing that the famously soft-hearted Lord of Casterly Rock was unlikely to press them for full payment. Neighboring houses started encroaching on Lannister territory, confident that Tytos would choose negotiation over military action even when faced with clear acts of aggression. Perhaps most damaging of all was the effect that Tytos' reputation had on his own bannermen, who began to question whether their ancient oaths of loyalty bound them to serve a lord who seemed incapable of protecting their interests or defending the honor of their house. The proud warriors who had served the Lannisters with distinction for generations found themselves the subject of mockery and contempt when they ventured beyond the Westerlands, forced to endure jokes about their toothless lion and their master's legendary reluctance to bare his claws. The financial consequences of Tytos' mismanagement proved almost as devastating as the damage to his house's reputation, as his generous nature and poor judgment combined to create a cascade of poor investments and defaulted loans that threatened the very foundation of Lannister wealth. The gold mines that had funded centuries of Lannister ambition continued to produce their precious metal, but the steady stream of income was increasingly offset by mounting debts and obligations that Tytos had accumulated through his misguided attempts to buy friendship and loyalty. The situation grew increasingly desperate as Tytos found himself trapped in a cycle of weakness and concession that only served to encourage further challenges to his authority. Each attempt to resolve conflicts through compromise and appeasement was interpreted as another sign of his inability to rule effectively, while his refusal to use the traditional tools of lordship gradually stripped him of the respect and fear that were essential to maintaining order in a feudal society. Among the most dangerous of Tytos' creditors and rivals was Lord Roger Rayne of Castamere, whose family had harbored ambitions toward Lannister lands and titles for generations. The Raynes possessed both the military strength and the political cunning necessary to pose a serious threat to Lannister supremacy, while their strategic location and network of alliances made them natural leaders for any coalition of discontented Westerlands lords. Under the leadership of the ambitious and ruthless Roger Rayne, this ancient rival house began to position itself as an alternative center of power within the region. The relationship between houses Lannister and Rayne had been complicated for centuries, marked by alternating periods of cooperation and rivalry that reflected the complex dynamics of regional politics in the Westerlands. During the era of the Kings of the Rock, the Raynes had served as loyal vassals, whose military prowess and administrative competence made them valuable allies in the constant struggle to maintain Lannister dominance over their fractious realm. Yet beneath this surface loyalty lay currents of resentment and ambition that only required the right circumstances to transform former allies into deadly enemies. The Raynes' growing boldness manifested itself in increasingly direct challenges to Lannister authority, as Lord Roger began to openly question Tytos' decisions and to position himself as a more competent alternative to the weak and indecisive Lord of Casterly Rock. These challenges were carefully calculated to test the limits of Tytos' patience, while avoiding actions that could be clearly defined as treasonous, allowing the Raynes to gradually accumulate power and influence while maintaining a veneer of formal loyalty. The situation was further complicated by the involvement of House Tarbeck, another ambitious family whose leaders saw an opportunity to advance their own interests by aligning themselves with the rising power of the Raynes. Lord Walderon Tarbeck and his formidable wife, Lady Ellen, proved to be natural allies for Roger Rayne, sharing both his ambitions and his contempt for Tytos' ineffective leadership. The alliance between these two houses created a formidable coalition that possessed both the military strength and the political legitimacy necessary to challenge Lannister supremacy within the Westerlands. The final provocation came when Lord Roger Rayne and Lord Walderon Tarbeck openly defied a direct command from Tytos, refusing to answer his summons to Casterly Rock and instead declaring their intention to govern their own lands without interference from their nominal overlord. This act of rebellion represented a fundamental challenge to the entire feudal system that governed Westeros, as it called into question the basic principle that vassals owed obedience to their liege lords, regardless of personal feelings or political disagreements. Tytos' response to this unprecedented challenge revealed the full extent of his weakness and indecision, as he hesitated to take decisive action even when faced with open rebellion. Rather than immediately mobilizing his forces to crush the uprising, he attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution that would allow the rebels to save face while formally acknowledging his authority. This approach only served to further damage his reputation while providing the rebels with additional time to strengthen their positions and gather support from other discontented lords. The rebellion that had begun as a challenge to Tytos's personal authority gradually transformed into something far more dangerous as other houses throughout the Westerlands began to question whether their traditional loyalty to House Lannister was worth maintaining. The sight of the mighty lions being defied with apparent impunity encouraged ambitious lords throughout the region to consider their own options, while the lack of swift retribution against the rebels suggested that the age of Lannister dominance might finally be drawing to a close. As the crisis deepened and the very survival of House Lannister hung in the balance, a new voice began to make itself heard within the halls of Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister, the eldest son and heir of the weak and indecisive lord, watched his father's mismanagement with growing fury and determination. Unlike Tytos, young Tywin possessed the ruthless pragmatism and calculating intelligence that had characterized the greatest Lannister leaders throughout history, along with a deep understanding of the harsh realities that governed the exercise of power in Westeros. The contrast between father and son could not have been more stark, as Tywin embodied everything that Tytos lacked in terms of natural authority and political instinct. Where Tytos sought to rule through kindness and conciliation, Tywin understood that true power required the willingness to use force when necessary, and to demonstrate that challenges to his authority would be met with swift and terrible retribution. The young heir watched his father's failures with the cold, analytical mind that would eventually make him one of the most feared and respected figures in the Seven Kingdoms. Yet even as Tywin's frustration with his father's weakness grew to dangerous levels, he remained bound by the bonds of duty and family loyalty that were fundamental to his character. The tension between his desire to take decisive action and his obligation to respect his father's authority created a volatile situation that could not continue indefinitely. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of the immediate rebellion, but the entire future direction of House Lannister. The moment of transformation that would define House Lannister for generations to come arrived not through careful planning or gradual transition, but through the explosive release of years of accumulated frustration and humiliation. When Tywin Lannister finally acted to save his family's reputation and secure their future, he did so with a ruthlessness and thoroughness that shocked even his closest allies and established him as one of the most feared figures in the Seven Kingdoms. The young heir, who had watched his father's weakness with growing fury, would prove that the blood of Lan the Clever still flowed strong in Lannister veins, though it would manifest itself in ways that few could have anticipated. The catalyst for Tywin's assumption of power came when the situation with the rebellious houses finally reached a point where even Tytos could no longer ignore the threat to his family's survival. Lord Roger Rayne and Lord Walderan Tarbeck had grown so bold in their defiance that they were openly mocking Lannister authority throughout the Westerlands, encouraging other houses to question their traditional loyalty and creating a dangerous precedent that threatened to unravel the entire feudal structure of the region. The final insult came when Lady Ellen Tarbeck, emboldened by her husband's apparent immunity from consequences, publicly declared that the lions of Casterly Rock had lost their claws and should step aside for stronger predators. The transformation in Tywin's demeanor when he learned of this latest provocation was immediate and terrifying to behold. Those who witnessed his reaction described a cold fury that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge, transforming the young man they had known into something far more dangerous and implacable. Without seeking his father's permission or consulting with the traditional advisors who had counseled patience and moderation, Tywin began issuing orders with an authority that brooked no argument or delay. The first indication that the age of Lannister weakness had come to an abrupt end came when Tywin summoned the captains of the household guard and the commanders of the family's military forces to a private meeting in the depths of Casterly Rock. The men who emerged from that conference were sworn to absolute secrecy, but their changed attitudes and the sudden efficiency with which they began preparing for war sent a clear message throughout the castle that a new hand was guiding Lannister policy. Tywin's strategic planning for the coming campaign revealed a mind that had absorbed every lesson of military history and political necessity, combining the traditional Lannister advantages of wealth and organization with innovations that would maximize the psychological impact of his response. He understood that mere victory would not be sufficient to restore his family's reputation, recognizing instead that the manner of that victory must be so complete and terrible that no one would ever again dare to challenge Lannister authority. The mobilization of Lannister forces proceeded with a speed and efficiency that caught the rebels completely off guard, as Tywin had correctly calculated that they would expect the same hesitation and delay that had characterized his father's responses to previous provocations. Instead of the lengthy negotiations and half measures that Tytos favored, the rebels found themselves facing the sudden appearance of a professional army that had been assembled and equipped with ruthless efficiency. The first target of Tywin's campaign was Tarbeck Hall, the ancestral seat of House Tarbeck, and the symbol of their ancient pride and independence. The siege that followed demonstrated Tywin's understanding that in warfare, as in politics, perception was often more important than reality. Rather than attempting a prolonged investment that might allow the defenders to negotiate or seek assistance from their allies, he ordered an immediate assault that overwhelmed the castle's defenses through sheer intensity and determination. The fall of Tarbeck Hall marked more than just a military victory, serving instead as a deliberate statement about the new reality of Lannister power and the consequences that awaited those who chose to challenge it. When Lord Walderon Tarbeck was killed defending his walls and Lady Ellen died in the flames that consumed her ancestral home, their deaths sent shockwaves throughout the Westerlands that reverberated far beyond the immediate conflict. Yet even the destruction of House Tarbeck paled in comparison to the fate that awaited the reigns of Castamere, whose greater wealth and stronger defenses presented Tywin with both a more challenging military problem and a more significant opportunity to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The ancient seat of House Rain had been carved into a hill, beneath which lay some of the richest gold and silver mines in the Westerlands, creating a fortress that was considered virtually impregnable by conventional siege tactics. Tywin's solution to the problem of Castamere revealed the same innovative thinking that had characterized the greatest Lannister leaders throughout history, combined with a cold ruthlessness that exceeded even the legends surrounding his ancestors. Rather than attempting to breach the castle's formidable defenses through direct assault, he ordered his engineers to divert the local streams and rivers, redirecting their flow into the mines that honeycomb the hill beneath the fortress. The systematic flooding of Castamere represented more than just a clever tactical solution to a difficult military problem, serving instead as a deliberate act of symbolic destruction that would echo through the generations. As the waters rose within the tunnels and chambers beneath the castle, the defenders found themselves trapped between the advancing flood and the Lannister forces that surrounded their walls. The choice before them was stark and unforgiving: surrender unconditionally, or face certain death in the rising waters. Lord Roger Rayne's final act of defiance came in his refusal to surrender, even when faced with the inevitable destruction of his house and family, choosing instead to die with his sword in his hand, rather than submit to the authority he had spent years challenging. His death in the flooded halls of his ancestral home marked the end of House Rain as a political force in the Westerlands, while the manner of their destruction served as a warning that would be remembered for centuries to come. The complete annihilation of houses Rain and Tarbeck sent shockwaves throughout Westeros that extended far beyond the immediate military significance of Tywin's victory. The brutality and thoroughness of his response demonstrated that the new generation of Lannister leadership possessed a ruthlessness that far exceeded anything their enemies had anticipated, while the innovative tactics employed in the destruction of Castamere proved that they retained the innovative thinking that had always characterized their house. Perhaps most significantly, the manner in which Tywin had assumed control of the campaign without formally deposing his father revealed a political sophistication that impressed even his critics. By acting decisively while maintaining the fiction of Tytos's continued authority, he had managed to restore Lannister power while avoiding the complications that would have arisen from an open challenge to his father's position. This delicate balance between filial duty and practical necessity would become characteristic of Tywin's approach to power throughout his life. The immediate aftermath of the Rain-Tarbeck Rebellion saw a fundamental transformation in the political landscape of the Westerlands, as the surviving houses hastened to reaffirm their loyalty to House Lannister with an enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. The fear that Tywin's victory had instilled throughout the region created a stability and order that had been absent during the years of his father's weakness. While the restoration of Lannister prestige attracted ambitious knights and lords from throughout Westeros, who sought to serve under a banner that once again commanded respect. The creation of the song that would immortalize Tywin's triumph represented perhaps the most enduring consequence of his brutal campaign against the rebellious houses. The Rains of Castamere began as a simple ballad recounting the destruction of House Rain. But it quickly evolved into something far more significant, becoming a musical symbol of Lannister power that would strike fear into the hearts of their enemies for generations to come. The haunting melody and ominous lyrics served as a constant reminder of what awaited those who dared to challenge the authority of Casterly Rock. Yet even as Tywin basked in the glory of his military triumph and the restoration of his family's reputation, he understood that lasting success would require more than fear and intimidation alone. The wealth that had been squandered during his father's reign needed to be rebuilt and carefully managed, while the political relationships that had been damaged by years of weakness required patient cultivation and strategic investment. The transformation of Tywin from reluctant heir to acknowledged leader of House Lannister was formalized through a series of gradual changes that saw him assume increasing responsibility for the day-to-day governance of the Westerlands. His father, perhaps recognizing his own limitations or simply relieved to be freed from burdens he had never been suited to bear, began delegating more and more authority to his capable son, creating a transition of power that was both smooth and irreversible. The marriage between Tywin and his cousin Joanna Lannister represented both a personal triumph and a political masterstroke, uniting two branches of the family while ensuring that the next generation of Lannister heirs would be born to parents who understood the responsibilities and opportunities that came with their position. Joanna's intelligence, grace, and political instincts made her an ideal partner for Tywin's ambitions, while their genuine affection for each other provided a foundation of happiness that would sustain them through the challenges to come. The birth of the twins, Cersei and Jaime, marked the beginning of a new chapter in Lannister history, as these children would grow up in a world where their family's power and prestige had been restored through their father's ruthless efficiency. The pride that Tywin took in his golden-haired children was matched only by his determination to ensure that they would never experience the humiliation and weakness that had characterized his own youth under his father's ineffective rule. The subsequent birth of Tyrion, marked by the tragedy of Joanna's death in childbirth, would cast a shadow over Tywin's personal happiness, while simultaneously testing his capacity for love and forgiveness. The loss of his beloved wife created a wound in Tywin's soul that would never fully heal, transforming him from a man capable of both love and cruelty into something harder and more implacable than even his enemies had imagined possible. As Tywin consolidated his control over the Westerlands and began to look beyond his own borders for opportunities to advance his family's interests, he understood that the lessons learned from the Rain-Tarbeck Rebellion would serve him well in the larger arena of Seven Kingdoms politics. The combination of wealth, military power, and ruthless determination that had restored Lannister dominance within their own region could be applied on a grander scale, potentially elevating his house to heights of influence that would rival even the great houses of ancient lineage. The transformation of Tywin Lannister from regional lord to one of the most influential figures in the Seven Kingdoms reached its culmination during the chaotic years of Robert's Rebellion, when the careful political calculations and strategic patience that had characterized his rise to power would be tested against the larger forces reshaping the realm. The rebellion that began with the supposed kidnapping of Lyanna Stark and the subsequent deaths at the hands of the Mad King would provide Tywin with the opportunity he had long awaited to elevate House Lannister from wealthy vassals to the very pinnacle of power in Westeros. The years leading up to the rebellion had seen Tywin establish himself as one of the most capable administrators in the realm, through his service as Hand of the King to Aerys II Targaryen. His appointment to this prestigious position represented the culmination of decades of careful political maneuvering and the recognition by the Iron Throne that Lannister wealth and competence had become indispensable to the effective governance of the Seven Kingdoms. Under Tywin's guidance, the royal treasury flourished. The realm's infrastructure improved dramatically, and the efficiency of royal administration reached heights not seen since the days of the conqueror himself. Yet beneath the surface of this successful partnership lay currents of tension and mutual distrust that would eventually tear apart the alliance between the Golden Lions and the Dragons. King Aerys II, increasingly paranoid and erratic as his reign progressed, began to see threats and conspiracies in every corner of his court, including among those who had served him most faithfully. The king's growing madness manifested itself in acts of cruelty and caprice that horrified even his closest supporters, while his suspicious nature led him to question the loyalty of men whose dedication had never wavered. The relationship between Tywin and Aerys had been complicated from the beginning by personal history and conflicting ambitions that stretched back to their youth when they had known each other as friends and companions. The transformation of that friendship into a political alliance based on mutual advantage had been successful for many years, but it could not survive the king's descent into paranoid madness and his increasing resentment of his hand's competence and popularity. The final break came when Aerys publicly humiliated Tywin by rejecting a proposed marriage alliance between their children, declaring that his heir would not wed the daughter of a mere servant. Tywin's resignation from his position as Hand of the King represented more than a personal slight or political disagreement, marking instead a fundamental shift in the balance of power within the Seven Kingdoms. The departure of the realm's most capable administrator left Aerys surrounded by flatterers and sycophants who lacked both the skill and the courage necessary to provide effective governance or honest counsel. Meanwhile, the return of Tywin to Casterly Rock meant that one of the kingdom's wealthiest and most militarily powerful houses was no longer bound by the obligations and constraints that came with royal service. The strategic position that Tywin adopted following his return to the Westerlands revealed the same calculating intelligence that had characterized his approach to every major decision throughout his career. Rather than immediately declaring for either side in the growing conflict between the crown and its rebellious subjects, he chose instead to maintain an official neutrality that allowed him to observe the developing situation while keeping his options open. This apparent indecision was actually a carefully calculated strategy designed to maximize Lannister advantages, regardless of which faction ultimately proved victorious. The military preparations that Tywin undertook during this period of supposed neutrality demonstrated his understanding that the coming conflict would require unprecedented resources and coordination. The gold mines of Casterly Rock funded the recruitment and training of additional forces, while the family's extensive network of alliances and obligations was activated to ensure that Lannister interests would be protected, regardless of the war's outcome. The sight of Lannister banners gathering in the Westerlands sent clear signals to all parties that one of the realm's great powers was preparing for action. The calculation that ultimately determined Tywin's entry into the rebellion was based on a cold assessment of military realities and political probabilities, rather than personal loyalty or ideological commitment to either cause. The defeat of the royal forces at the Battle of the Trident had effectively decided the war's outcome, leaving Aerys isolated in King's Landing, with only the remnants of his once mighty army and the increasingly desperate hope that the approaching rebels might somehow be turned back at the city's gates. Tywin's decision to finally commit his forces came at the moment when victory for Robert's cause seemed assured but not yet complete, allowing him to claim credit for the rebellion's success while minimizing his own risks and casualties. The march of the Lannister army toward King's Landing was presented as a relief force coming to aid the beleaguered king, a fiction that provided political cover for what was actually a carefully timed intervention designed to secure maximum advantage from the changing political landscape. The approach of Lannister forces to the capital created a moment of unprecedented opportunity and danger, as the defenders of King's Landing found themselves forced to make a crucial decision about whether to trust their supposed allies or prepare for yet another siege. The gates of the city had been closed against Robert's advancing army, But the sight of Lannister banners approaching from the west forced the royal council to choose between maintaining their defenses and allowing their potential saviors inside the walls. The decision to open the gates to Tywin's army proved to be the final and most catastrophic mistake in a reign marked by increasingly poor judgment and paranoid delusions. What the defenders had hoped would be salvation instead became the instrument of their destruction. As the Lannister forces that entered the city, under the pretense of providing aid instead, began the systematic sack of the capital that would forever stain their reputation and establish their dominance over the new regime. The sack of King's Landing that followed revealed a side of Lannister power that few had seen since the destruction of Castamere, as Tywin's carefully controlled public persona gave way to the ruthless pragmatism that had always lurked beneath the surface. The orders he gave to his commanders were precise and uncompromising, designed to eliminate all potential threats to Robert's rule, while simultaneously demonstrating Lannister power and securing their position in the new order that was about to emerge. The systematic violence that engulfed the capital during those terrible hours was not the result of military necessity or spontaneous passion, but rather the calculated implementation of a political strategy designed to bind the Lannisters irrevocably to Robert's cause, while eliminating any possibility of Targaryen restoration. The targeting of specific individuals and locations reflected careful planning rather than random destruction, ensuring that the rebellion's victory would be complete and permanent, while maximizing the psychological impact of Lannister participation. The deaths of Prince Rhaegar's wife and children represented the most controversial and consequential aspect of the sack, as these murders crossed lines that even hardened warriors found difficult to accept. Yet from Tywin's perspective, these killings were not acts of cruelty, but necessary political calculations designed to remove any future threat to Robert's reign, while demonstrating Lannister commitment to the new order. The presentation of the bodies to Robert himself served as both a gift and a test, forcing the new king to either accept or reject the methods that had secured his victory. The role played by Sir Jaime Lannister in the death of King Aerys II added another layer of complexity to the family's involvement in the rebellion's climax, as the young knight's decision to slay his sworn king was driven by factors that went beyond simple political calculation. The threat posed by Aerys's plans to destroy the entire city with wildfire had forced Jaime to choose between his oath of loyalty and his duty to protect innocent lives, a decision that would earn him both infamy and the title that would follow him for the rest of his life. The aftermath of the sack revealed the full extent of Tywin's strategic thinking, as the immediate chaos and destruction gave way to a carefully orchestrated campaign to legitimize Lannister actions and secure their position within Robert's new government. The marriage alliance between Cersei Lannister and the new king represented the culmination of decades of political maneuvering, transforming the Lannisters from rebellious vassals into the royal family's closest allies and most powerful supporters. Robert's decision to pardon the Lannister participants in the sack, while accepting Cersei as his queen, reflected both political necessity and personal pragmatism, as the new king understood that his reign would require the support of the realm's wealthiest and most militarily powerful house. The gold of Casterly Rock had helped finance his rebellion, while Lannister military might would be essential for maintaining order in a kingdom still recovering from the wounds of civil war. The integration of House Lannister into the new royal establishment proceeded with remarkable speed and efficiency, as Tywin leveraged his family's enhanced position to secure appointments and advantages that would serve their interests for years to come. The careful placement of Lannister allies in key positions throughout the government created a network of influence that extended far beyond their traditional strongholds in the Westerlands, while the wealth that flowed from Casterly Rock's mines ensured that their support would be both valuable and necessary. Yet even as Tywin celebrated his political triumph and the elevation of his daughter to queenship, he understood that the methods employed during the sack had created enemies and resentments that would pose ongoing challenges to Lannister security and reputation. The brutality displayed during those crucial hours had achieved its immediate objectives, but it had also established patterns of behavior and expectation that would influence how others perceived and interacted with his family for generations to come. The long-term consequences of the sack extended far beyond the immediate political advantages it had secured, creating ripple effects that would continue to shape the political landscape of Westeros for decades. The resentment of Dorne over the murders of Elia Martell and her children would create a lasting source of instability in the south, while the fear inspired by Lannister ruthlessness would influence the calculations of every other great house when dealing with the Lions of Casterly Rock. The marriage between Cersei Lannister and Robert Baratheon represented more than a simple political alliance, marking instead the beginning of a complex and ultimately tragic relationship that would shape the destiny of both houses for the next generation. What had been conceived as a union of mutual advantage between the realm's new king and its wealthiest family would evolve into a source of bitter discord and hidden conspiracies that would eventually threaten the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. The golden-haired daughter of Tywin Lannister brought to her marriage not only her family's vast wealth and political influence, but also the proud intelligence and ruthless ambition that had characterized her bloodline for the Lime and centuries. From the very beginning, the fundamental incompatibility between Robert and Cersei created tensions that no amount of political necessity could fully overcome. The king, still mourning his lost love, Lyanna Stark, and seeking solace in wine, women, and the hunt, found himself bound to a woman whose sharp wit and piercing green eyes reminded him constantly of duties and obligations he preferred to ignore. Cersei, raised from childhood to expect greatness and trained in the subtle arts of politics and manipulation, discovered that her royal husband possessed neither the intelligence nor the ambition necessary to fully utilize the power that had fallen into his hands. The early years of their marriage were marked by attempts on both sides to make the best of their situation, as political necessity demanded at least the appearance of harmony between the royal couple. Robert's genuine efforts to connect with his new queen were undermined by his inability to abandon the behaviors and attachments that had characterized his bachelor years, while Cersei's desire to fulfill her role as queen was complicated by her growing contempt for a husband she viewed as weak and unworthy of the crown he wore. The birth of their first child, a dark-haired son whose brief life ended in fever before he could be named heir to the Iron Throne, represented both a moment of genuine connection between the royal couple and a foreshadowing of the tragedies that would define their relationship. For a brief period, the shared grief over their lost child seemed to offer the possibility of real affection between Robert and Cersei, as the king's natural warmth and the queen's fierce maternal instincts created common ground that transcended their political obligations. Yet even as Robert and Cersei mourned their lost son, forces were already at work that would forever prevent them from finding the happiness and partnership that might have stabilized the realm and secured their dynasty. The secret relationship between Cersei and her twin brother Jaime, which had begun in childhood and continued despite their separation, represented a fundamental betrayal of both marriage vows and political necessity that would cast a shadow over every subsequent development in their lives. The resumption of the incestuous relationship between the Lannister twins reflected not merely personal desire, but a deeper rejection of the political arrangements that had elevated Cersei to queenship while simultaneously separating her from the one person she truly loved. Jaime's appointment to the Kingsguard, ostensibly an honor that reflected his prowess as a knight and his family's elevated status, had actually been intended by Tywin as a way to keep his heir close to the centers of power, while ensuring Lannister influence over the royal court for generations to come. The conspiracy of silence that surrounded the true nature of Cersei and Jaime's relationship required careful planning and constant vigilance, as discovery would bring not only personal destruction, but the complete collapse of everything the Lannister family had worked to achieve. The lovers developed an elaborate system of signals and secret meetings that allowed them to maintain their forbidden relationship while presenting a convincing facade of propriety to the outside world, a deception that required the complicity of trusted servants and the careful management of every aspect of their public lives. The birth of Prince Joffrey in the second year of Robert's reign marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the conspiracy, as the golden-haired child bore unmistakable signs of his true parentage that could potentially expose the entire deception. The prince's striking resemblance to his mother and her family, combined with his complete lack of any Baratheon characteristics, created a situation that would require increasingly elaborate explanations and justifications as he grew older, and the differences became more pronounced. Robert's enthusiastic acceptance of Joffrey as his legitimate heir reflected both his genuine desire for a son to carry on his dynasty and his fundamental inability or unwillingness to see the obvious signs of deception that surrounded him. The king's preference for hunting, drinking, and other distractions over the careful observation of court politics created opportunities for the conspiracy to flourish, while simultaneously making him vulnerable to manipulation by those who understood the true situation. The subsequent births of Princess Myrcella and Prince Tommen continued the pattern established with Joffrey, as each golden-haired child provided additional evidence of their true parentage, while simultaneously making the conspiracy more complex and dangerous. The presence of 3 supposed royal children who bore no resemblance to their alleged father created a situation that became increasingly difficult to explain or ignore, particularly as other members of the court began to notice and comment on the family's unusual appearance. Meanwhile, the political and administrative responsibilities of the kingdom fell increasingly to others as Robert retreated from the duties of kingship into a life of pleasure and indulgence. The hand of the king, Jon Arryn, assumed many of the day-to-day responsibilities of governance, while the small council managed the complex business of administering the 7 kingdoms with minimal input from their sovereign. This delegation of authority created opportunities for ambitious courtiers and political factions to advance their own interests, while the king remained blissfully unaware of the schemes and conspiracies developing around him. Tywin Lannister's withdrawal to Casterly Rock following his daughter's marriage represented a calculated decision to maintain distance from the immediate centers of power, while ensuring that Lannister interests remained protected. Through Cersei's position and influence, this strategic retreat allowed him to avoid becoming entangled in the petty politics and personal conflicts that characterized Robert's court, while maintaining the ability to intervene decisively when circumstances required his direct involvement. The financial arrangements that bound the Iron Throne to House Lannister created a relationship of mutual dependence that served both parties' interests, while gradually shifting the balance of power in favor of the wealthier partner. Robert's extravagant lifestyle and generous nature, combined with his complete disinterest in fiscal responsibility, created mounting debts that could only be serviced through increasingly large loans from the Lannister treasury, effectively making the crown dependent on Casterly Rock's continued support and goodwill. The growing influence of Lannister gold throughout the kingdoms created networks of obligation and loyalty that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of feudal service. As ambitious lords and merchants found themselves drawn into the golden web of debt and favor that emanated from Casterly Rock, these financial relationships provided the Lannisters with sources of information and influence that complemented their formal political position, creating multiple channels through which they could advance their interests and protect their secrets. The adventures and reputation of Tyrion Lannister during this period provided both entertainment and concern for his family, as the dwarf son of Tywin carved out his own unique position within the complex social hierarchy of Westeros. His wit, intelligence, and irreverent attitude toward authority made him a popular figure at court and throughout the realm, while his obvious physical differences ensured that he would never be mistaken for a conventional heir or political threat. Tyrion's marriage to the peasant girl Tysha, though quickly annulled through his father's intervention, revealed both his capacity for genuine affection and his vulnerability to manipulation by those who understood his desperate desire for acceptance and love. The cruel deception orchestrated by Tywin to end this relationship demonstrated the lengths to which he would go to protect what he viewed as his family's reputation and interests, while simultaneously creating lasting wounds in his relationship with his youngest son. The service of Jaime Lannister in the Kingsguard created its own set of complications and opportunities, as his dual roles as royal protector and secret lover required careful navigation of competing loyalties and obligations. His reputation as one of the finest knights in the Seven Kingdoms provided cover for his frequent presence near the Queen, while his oath of celibacy served as an additional layer of protection against accusations or suspicions about the true nature of their relationship. The growing tension between Robert's disinterest in governance and the increasing complexity of the challenges facing the realm created opportunities for capable administrators and ambitious politicians to assume greater influence over royal policy. The small council became the de facto governing body of the Seven Kingdoms, making decisions and implementing policies with minimal oversight, from a king who preferred hunting to holding court and wine to wrestling with the details of statecraft. The investigation undertaken by Lord John Arryn in the final years of his life represented the greatest threat to the Lannister conspiracy since its inception, as the elderly hand began to piece together the evidence that pointed toward the true parentage of the royal children. His methodical examination of genealogical records and his careful observation of the physical characteristics displayed by various noble families brought him dangerously close to uncovering the secret that would destroy both the royal marriage and the political alliance it represented. The sudden death of John Arryn, whether by natural causes or more sinister means, eliminated the immediate threat to the conspiracy, while simultaneously creating a power vacuum that would have far-reaching consequences for the stability of the realm. His investigation had progressed far enough to plant seeds of suspicion in other minds, while his death removed one of the few figures capable of providing wise counsel and steady leadership during the turbulent times that lay ahead. The appointment of Eddard Stark as the new Hand of the King brought to King's Landing a man whose rigid sense of honor and justice made him both an ideal choice for the position and a potentially devastating threat to those whose power depended on deception and compromise. Stark's investigation into the circumstances surrounding his predecessor's death would inevitably lead him down the same path of discovery that had occupied Arryn's final months, setting the stage for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the Seven Kingdoms and expose the hidden truths that had shaped more than a decade of apparent peace and prosperity. The revelation of the conspiracy that had hidden the true parentage of the royal children marked the beginning of the most devastating conflict in Westeros since Aegon's conquest, as the exposure of long-buried secrets shattered the delicate political balance that had maintained relative peace throughout Robert's reign. Eddard Stark's discovery of the truth about Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen represented more than a simple scandal, threatening instead to invalidate the entire succession and plunge the Seven Kingdoms into a war that would consume noble houses and small folk alike in its terrible fury. The death of King Robert, whether by hunting accident or more deliberate design, created the immediate crisis that transformed private conspiracy into public catastrophe. The ascension of Prince Joffrey to the Iron Throne, backed by the full might of House Lannister and their allies, represented a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Targaryen succession laws and the fundamental principles that governed royal authority throughout the realm. Those who knew or suspected the truth about his parentage faced an impossible choice between accepting a bastard king or plunging the kingdom into civil war. Queen Cersei's assumption of power as Queen Regent during her son's minority revealed the full extent of Lannister ambition and the careful planning that had preceded this moment of crisis. Her swift elimination of potential threats, including the arrest and execution of Eddard Stark, demonstrated a ruthlessness that matched her father's legendary efficiency, while simultaneously ensuring that the conspiracy would never be fully exposed or legally proven. The brutality with which she consolidated power sent clear messages to all potential opponents about the costs of resistance. The response to Joffrey's coronation throughout the Seven Kingdoms revealed the depth of the political crisis that the Lannister conspiracy had created, as multiple claimants emerged to challenge his right to rule, and the realm fractured along lines of loyalty, ambition, and ancient grievance. Robb Stark's declaration of independence in the north, Stannis Baratheon's assertion of his superior claim as Robert's legitimate heir, and Renly Baratheon's popular uprising in the south created a complex web of competing loyalties that would drag every major house into the coming conflict. The military preparations undertaken by House Lannister in response to these multiple challenges demonstrated both their substantial advantages and the enormous scope of the crisis they faced. The wealth of Casterly Rock allowed them to field larger armies and maintain them for longer periods than most of their opponents, while their central position in Westeros provided strategic advantages that Tywin exploited with his characteristic tactical brilliance. Yet even Lannister gold and organization could not overcome the fundamental problem of fighting multiple enemies on different fronts while maintaining control over a hostile capital. Tywin's return to active military command marked the beginning of a campaign that would showcase both his strategic genius and his willingness to employ any means necessary to achieve victory. His systematic approach to the war revealed lessons learned from decades of successful military and political operations, as he combined traditional Lannister strengths with innovative tactics designed to maximize their advantages while exploiting their enemies' weaknesses. The speed and efficiency with which he mobilized the Westerlands demonstrated that age had not diminished his capacity for decisive action. The early phases of the war saw a series of stunning Lannister victories that seemed to vindicate Tywin's confidence in his family's military superiority. Yet these successes came at enormous costs that would prove increasingly difficult to sustain. The capture of important enemy leaders, the destruction of rival armies, and the conquest of strategic territories provided tactical advantages while creating new obligations and vulnerabilities that stretched Lannister resources beyond their traditional limits. The imprisonment and eventual escape of Jaime Lannister represented both a personal catastrophe for the family and a strategic disaster that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the war. His capture by Robb Stark's forces deprived the Lannisters of one of their most capable military commanders while providing their enemies with a valuable hostage whose exchange could secure significant concessions. The psychological impact of seeing the legendary knight reduced to captivity sent shockwaves throughout the Lannister camp and provided propaganda victories for their opponents. The complex negotiations surrounding Jaime's eventual release revealed the intricate web of personal relationships and political calculations that influenced every aspect of the war's conduct. Catelyn Stark's decision to free him in exchange for her daughters demonstrated how family loyalty could override political strategy, while Jaime's subsequent journey back to King's Landing with Brienne of Tarth provided opportunities for character development and alliance building that would have long-term consequences for House Lannister's position. The Red Wedding represented perhaps the most shocking and consequential event of the entire war, as Tywin's alliance with House Frey and the Bolton faction within the north eliminated the primary threat to Lannister supremacy through treachery rather than military victory. The systematic slaughter of Robb Stark, his mother, and his principal supporters at what should have been a celebration of peace and alliance demonstrated the lengths to which Tywin would go to secure his family's position, while simultaneously establishing new precedents for the conduct of warfare in Westeros. The political ramifications of the Red Wedding extended far beyond its immediate military impact, as the violation of guest right and the murder of a king under the protection of sacred hospitality laws created moral outrage that would fuel resistance to Lannister rule for years to come. The short-term strategic victory achieved through this act of treachery was accompanied by long-term costs in terms of legitimacy and popular support that would complicate every subsequent Lannister military and political operation. The trial and tribulations of Tyrion Lannister during this period provided both comic relief and profound tragedy, as the dwarf son of Tywin found himself caught between his family loyalty and his personal moral convictions. His service as acting Hand of the King during the Battle of the Blackwater demonstrated his intellectual capabilities and strategic thinking, while his subsequent legal troubles revealed the complex dynamics within House Lannister and the price of challenging established authority. The Battle of the Blackwater marked the turning point in the war's early phases, as the successful defense of King's Landing against Stannis Baratheon's assault preserved Lannister control over the capital, while demonstrating their ability to overcome seemingly impossible odds through superior planning and execution. The innovative use of wildfire as a naval weapon, combined with the timely arrival of Tywin's relieving force, created a victory that seemed almost miraculous in its scope and consequences. The alliance forged between House Lannister and House Tyrell in the aftermath of the Blackwater represented a masterpiece of political negotiation that transformed potential enemies into powerful allies while securing the resources necessary for continued resistance. The marriage arrangements that sealed this partnership demonstrated Tywin's understanding that political marriages remained the most effective method for creating lasting bonds between great houses, while the integration of Tyrell forces into Lannister military operations provided the additional strength needed to achieve final victory. The assassination of King Joffrey at his own wedding feast marked both the climax and the beginning of the end of the war's most active phase, as the removal of the controversial young king eliminated one source of political instability while creating new opportunities for reconciliation and peace. The manner of his death, poisoned during what should have been the happiest day of his life, sent shockwaves throughout the kingdom, while demonstrating that even the most carefully guarded rulers remained vulnerable to determined enemies. The trial of Tyrion Lannister for his nephew's murder revealed the deep fractures within House Lannister itself, as family loyalty competed with political necessity and personal grudges influenced what should have been purely legal proceedings. The spectacular trial by combat that resulted from Tyrion's refusal to accept a guilty verdict provided dramatic entertainment, while simultaneously resolving multiple political and personal conflicts through the ancient mechanism of divine judgment. The death of Prince Oberyn Martell during his combat with Ser Gregor Clegane eliminated one of the most dangerous enemies of House Lannister, while simultaneously ensuring that Dorne's hostility toward the family would continue, unabated. The Dornish prince's quest for vengeance had brought him to King's Landing with the explicit intention of destroying those responsible for his sister's death, and his failure to achieve this goal ensured that the Southern Kingdom would remain a source of instability and resistance. The culminating act of family violence that ended Tywin's life came not from external enemies but from within his own house, as Tyrion's decision to murder his father represented the ultimate consequence of decades of accumulated resentment and abuse. The death of the most powerful and feared man in Westeros at the hands of his own son sent shockwaves throughout the Seven Kingdoms, while simultaneously removing the strategic genius whose planning and execution had secured Lannister victory in the war. The escape of Tyrion from King's Landing, aided by his brother Jaime's guilty conscience and Varys's political calculations, deprived House Lannister of both a family member and a potential asset, while providing their enemies with a valuable ally whose intimate knowledge of Lannister's strengths and weaknesses could prove devastating in future conflicts. The transformation of Tyrion from loyal family member to potential enemy represented one of the most significant consequences of the war's personal costs. The consolidation of Lannister power in the aftermath of the war's conclusion required careful management of victory's consequences, as the family found themselves ruling over a kingdom exhausted by conflict and deeply suspicious of their methods and motivations. The challenge of transforming military success into lasting political stability would test whether the lessons learned during the war could be applied to the more complex task of governing in peace. The death of Tywin Lannister marked not only the end of an era, but the beginning of House Lannister's most precarious and ultimately tragic chapter, as the family's remaining members struggled to maintain their grip on power without the strategic genius and ruthless efficiency that had elevated them to the heights of influence. The vacuum left by Tywin's assassination created opportunities for ambitious rivals, while simultaneously exposing the fundamental weaknesses that his iron will and careful planning had previously concealed from both enemies and allies alike. Cersei Lannister's assumption of greater authority in the wake of her father's death revealed both her fierce determination to protect her remaining children and her dangerous inability to distinguish between strength and cruelty, wisdom and paranoia. The lessons she had absorbed from observing Tywin's methods had focused primarily on the application of fear and violence, while overlooking the subtler aspects of statecraft that had made his rule effective. Her attempts to govern through intimidation alone would prove catastrophically inadequate when faced with challenges that required diplomatic finesse and political compromise. The coronation of Tommen Baratheon as the new king represented both an opportunity for reconciliation and a reminder of the fundamental illegitimacy that continued to undermine Lannister claims to power. The young king's gentle nature and obvious desire for peace offered hope that the brutal excesses of his brother's reign might be replaced by more moderate policies. Yet his obvious dependence on his mother's guidance ensured that the same conspiratorial elements that had characterized Joffrey's rule would continue to influence royal decisions. The rise of the faith militant under the charismatic leadership of the High Sparrow created an unprecedented challenge to Lannister authority, as the restoration of the church's military power provided a focus for popular discontent, while simultaneously appealing to genuine religious conviction throughout the kingdom. The movement's ability to combine spiritual authority with political resistance made it particularly dangerous to a ruling family whose legitimacy rested primarily on military force and financial influence rather than moral authority or popular support. Cersei's initial attempts to manipulate the faith militant for her own political purposes demonstrated both her tactical cunning and her fundamental misunderstanding of the forces she was attempting to control. The restoration of the church's right to bear arms had been intended as a weapon against her enemies, particularly the influential Tyrell family, whose growing power threatened Lannister dominance over the young king. Yet the religious movement's inherent independence and moral certainty made it impossible to control through the traditional methods of bribery and intimidation that had served the Lannisters so well in previous conflicts. The imprisonment of Queen Margaery Tyrell and her brother Loras on charges of moral corruption represented the culmination of Cersei's campaign against the family that had become her primary rivals for influence over the throne. The success of these arrests seemed to vindicate her strategy of using religious authority to eliminate political opponents, yet the precedent established by the faith's willingness to challenge even the highest nobility would soon threaten the Lannisters themselves with devastating consequences. The dramatic reversal of fortune that saw Cersei herself arrested and imprisoned by the very forces she had sought to manipulate revealed the fundamental miscalculation that had undermined her entire strategy. The High Sparrow's investigation into the Queen Mother's own moral conduct, including her relationship with her cousin Lancel and various other indiscretions, demonstrated that religious authority recognized no distinction between political allies and enemies when evaluating moral transgressions according to divine law. The humiliation of Cersei's imprisonment and subsequent walk of atonement through the streets of King's Landing represented one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in the long history of House Lannister, as the proud daughter of Tywin was reduced to public shame and ridicule by enemies she had underestimated. The brutal honesty of the crowd's reaction to her naked vulnerability revealed the depth of popular resentment that had accumulated during years of Lannister rule, while the personal trauma of the experience would have lasting psychological consequences that would influence her subsequent decisions. The regency of Kevan Lannister during Cersei's imprisonment represented a brief return to the more measured and competent governance that had characterized Tywin's approach to power, as the younger brother possessed many of the same administrative skills, while lacking the ruthless ambition that had driven his elder sibling to increasingly extreme measures. His appointment as Hand of the King and Protector of the Realm promised a period of stability and reconciliation that might have allowed the kingdom to recover from the wounds inflicted by years of civil war and religious conflict. Yet even as Kevan worked to restore effective governance and rebuild the Lannister reputation through competence rather than fear, darker forces were gathering that would ultimately overwhelm his efforts and plunge the kingdom into an even more devastating crisis. The growing threat posed by Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons in the east, combined with reports of supernatural dangers beyond the Wall in the north, created challenges that would test the limits of conventional political and military responses. Cersei's return to power following her Walk of Atonement marked a fundamental transformation in her character and approach to governance, as the trauma and humiliation she had endured hardened her remaining capacity for mercy while intensifying her paranoid suspicions about the loyalty of those around her. The woman who emerged from the Great Sept's dungeons bore little resemblance to the calculating politician who had entered them, having been transformed by suffering into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The planning and execution of the destruction of the Great Sept of Baelor represented perhaps the most audacious and catastrophic act in the entire history of House Lannister, as Cersei's decision to eliminate her enemies through mass murder demonstrated a complete abandonment of the political restraint that had previously characterized her family's approach to power. The use of wildfire to destroy the center of religious authority in King's Landing, along with most of her principal opponents, showed both her tactical brilliance and her complete disregard for the moral and political consequences of such extreme action. The deaths of Queen Marjorie, the High Sparrow, and numerous other political figures in the explosion that consumed the Great Sept eliminated most of Cersei's immediate enemies, while simultaneously removing many of the kingdom's most capable leaders and administrators. The power vacuum created by this act of terrorism would prove impossible to fill, while the method employed sent clear messages about the lengths to which the remaining Lannisters would go to maintain their grip on power. The suicide of King Tommen following the destruction of his queen and her family marked the final collapse of the pretense that had sustained Lannister rule since Robert's death, as the extinction of the supposed Baratheon line removed even the fictional legitimacy that had justified their occupation of the Iron Throne. The young king's death represented both a personal tragedy for Cersei and a political catastrophe that left her without any legal claim to continued authority over the Seven Kingdoms. Cersei's coronation as Queen of Westeros in her own right represented an unprecedented break with traditional succession laws and established precedents, as no woman had ever claimed the Iron Throne through conquest rather than inheritance or marriage. Her assumption of royal authority marked the formal establishment of a new Lannister dynasty, yet it also ensured that her rule would face immediate challenges from multiple claimants whose own legitimacy claims were far stronger than her own. The isolation of Cersei's regime became increasingly apparent, as former allies distanced themselves from a ruler whose methods had become too extreme even for the brutal standards of Westerosi politics. The withdrawal of support from traditional Lannister allies, combined with the growing strength of external threats, created a situation where the Queen found herself ruling over a kingdom that existed more in theory than in practice, with effective control limited to the immediate vicinity of the capital. The alliance with Euron Greyjoy and his Iron Fleet represented both a desperate attempt to maintain military relevance and a fundamental compromise of the principles that had previously guided Lannister policy. The Ironborn King's notorious reputation for cruelty and unpredictability made him a dangerous ally whose own ambitions clearly extended far beyond simple military cooperation. Yet Cersei's increasingly desperate situation left her with few alternatives for maintaining the strength necessary to resist her growing list of enemies. The hiring of the Golden Company from across the Narrow Sea marked another milestone in the decline of Lannister power, as the family that had once commanded the loyalty of the entire Westerlands found itself reduced to relying on foreign mercenaries whose allegiance could only be maintained through regular payments from a treasury that was rapidly approaching exhaustion. The irony of this situation was not lost on observers who remembered the days when Lannister gold had been considered the most reliable currency in the known world. The approaching storm, represented by Daenerys Targaryen's invasion fleet, supported by dragons and armies from across the Narrow Sea, created a threat that dwarfed all previous challenges to Lannister authority, while simultaneously offering an opportunity for those who had suffered under their rule to finally achieve revenge. The restoration of the Targaryen dynasty, backed by overwhelming military force, promised to sweep away not only Cersei's regime but the entire political order that had emerged from Robert's rebellion. The siege and destruction of King's Landing marked the final act in the long history of House Lannister as a ruling dynasty, as the city that had been the center of their power for nearly 2 decades was reduced to ash and rubble by dragonfire and military assault. The deaths of Cersei and Jaime in the collapsing ruins of the Red Keep brought to an end the incestuous relationship that had sparked the conflicts which consumed the Seven Kingdoms, while simultaneously eliminating the last direct threats to Targaryen restoration. The survival of Tyrion Lannister as the sole remaining son of Tywin created an unexpected opportunity for the family name to continue, though under circumstances that would have been unimaginable during the height of their power. His appointment as Hand of the King to the new ruler represented both personal redemption and a final ironic twist in the family's long journey from legendary tricksters to royal counselors, proving that adaptability and intelligence remained valuable, even after the collapse of everything else the Lannisters had built. With the collapse of the Red Keep and the deaths of Cersei and Jaime beneath tons of falling stone, the golden age of House Lannister came to its inevitable end. marking the conclusion of a dynasty that had shaped the political landscape of Westeros for generations through their unique combination of wealth, cunning, and ruthless ambition. The lions who had once roared so proudly from the heights of Casterly Rock found their pride humbled and their power scattered like coins from a broken purse, victims of their own hubris and the inexorable wheel of fortune that raises the mighty only to cast them down again. The irony of their final fate was not lost on those who remembered the family's meteoric rise from the ashes of their humiliation under Lord Tytos, as the very qualities that had elevated them to unprecedented heights ultimately proved to be the instruments of their destruction. The ruthless pragmatism that had restored their reputation after the Rain Tarbeck rebellion had gradually transformed into a callous disregard for moral boundaries, while the intelligence and adaptability inherited from Lan the Clever had been corrupted by pride and paranoia into instruments of self-destruction rather than survival. Tyrion Lannister's survival as the last son of his line represented more than mere chance, embodying instead the enduring power of the intellectual gifts that had always been the family's greatest strength. His appointment as Hand of the King to Bran the Broken marked both a personal vindication and a final testament to the value of wisdom over force, proving that even in the aftermath of catastrophic failure, the right combination of intelligence and adaptability could still find a path to relevance and influence. The transformation of the surviving Lannister from kinslayer and exile to trusted counselor demonstrated the same capacity for reinvention that had characterized his ancestors' greatest triumphs, though under circumstances that stripped away all pretense of inherited authority or traditional privilege. His new position required him to serve rather than command, to advise rather than rule. Yet in many ways this represented a return to the fundamental strengths that had originally elevated his house from clever tricksters to masters of the realm. The legacy of House Lannister extended far beyond the personal fates of its final members, having fundamentally altered the political and social structures of Westeros in ways that would influence the kingdom's development for generations to come. Their elevation of wealth over birth as a source of power had challenged traditional feudal hierarchies, while their willingness to employ any means necessary to achieve their goals had redefined the boundaries of acceptable political behavior throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The songs and stories that would immortalize their memory reflected the complex nature of their historical impact, as bards and chroniclers struggled to reconcile the undeniable magnificence of their achievements with the moral costs of their methods. The Rains of Castamere would continue to be sung in halls throughout Westeros, serving as both a celebration of Lannister power and a warning about the consequences of challenging those who possessed the will to destroy their enemies completely and utterly. The financial systems and trade networks that the Lannisters had established during their centuries of dominance would outlive their political authority, creating lasting changes in the economic structure of Westeros that reflected their understanding of wealth as both a tool of power and a source of independence. The precedents they had set for using gold to purchase loyalty, secure alliances, and overcome traditional obstacles would continue to influence political calculations long after their own treasury had been emptied by war and rebellion. The architectural monuments to their power, from the golden splendor of Casterly Rock to the improvements they had funded in King's Landing, would serve as physical reminders of their influence for centuries to come. Yet even these tangible legacies would gradually fade and crumble, reflecting the ultimate futility of attempting to achieve immortality through material accomplishments, rather than moral example or beneficial impact on the lives of common people. The psychological impact of the Lannister rise and fall on the noble houses of Westeros created lasting changes in political culture and strategic thinking that would influence how future generations approached the pursuit and exercise of power. Their demonstration that traditional sources of authority could be overcome through intelligence and resources had inspired countless imitators, while their ultimate destruction served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and moral compromise. The academic study of Lannister history would provide future scholars and political theorists with rich material for understanding the complex relationships between wealth, power, and legitimacy in feudal societies. Their success in transforming economic advantages into political dominance offered lessons for ambitious houses, while their eventual failure illustrated the importance of maintaining moral authority and popular support, even in systems based primarily on force and fear. The religious implications of their story resonated deeply with the faithful throughout the Seven Kingdoms, as the ultimate fate of the family seemed to validate ancient teachings about pride preceding destruction and the temporary nature of earthly power. The faith of the Seven would incorporate the Lannister narrative into its moral instruction, using their rise and fall as an example of how even the mightiest mortals remained subject to divine justice and the fundamental laws that governed human behavior. The military innovations and tactical developments that had emerged from Lannister campaigns would continue to influence warfare throughout Westeros, as their emphasis on professional soldiers, superior equipment, and strategic use of resources had raised the standards expected of military forces throughout the realm. Future commanders would study their victories and defeats, learning lessons about logistics, coordination, and the importance of maintaining multiple options in complex political situations. The cultural impact of their patronage during their years of greatest power had fostered developments in art, literature, and learning that would outlive their political influence, creating lasting contributions to Westerosi civilization that reflected their understanding of culture as both a source of prestige and a tool of soft power. The libraries they had funded, the artists they had supported, and the festivals they had sponsored had enriched the intellectual and artistic life of the kingdom in ways that transcended their immediate political purposes. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Lannister legacy lay in the fundamental question their story posed about the nature of power itself and the price that must be paid for its acquisition and maintenance. Their journey from clever outsiders to royal dynasty and finally to destruction illustrated the eternal human struggle between ambition and morality, between the desire for security and the temptation of dominance, between the love of family and the demands of political necessity. As the survivors of their reign rebuilt their lives and their kingdoms in the aftermath of destruction, they carried with them the memory of what the Lannisters had achieved and the knowledge of what they had ultimately cost. The Golden Lions had roared their last roar, but the echo of their voices would continue to resonate through the halls of power, wherever ambitious men and women gathered to plot the rise of their own houses and the advancement of their own dreams. In the end, the story of House Lannister served as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating that while intelligence, wealth, and determination could indeed move mountains and topple kingdoms, they could not overcome the fundamental truth that all power was temporary and all dynasties were mortal. Their words, "A Lannister always pays his debts," had proven prophetic in ways they never intended, as the final accounting of their reign revealed that every advantage gained through moral compromise had eventually demanded its own terrible price in blood and sorrow. The wheel of fortune continued to turn in Westeros, carrying new houses to prominence, while casting others down into obscurity. But the memory of the Golden Lions would endure as a testament to both the heights that could be achieved through cunning and ambition, and the depths to which even the mightiest could fall when pride and power corrupted the very virtues that had made their rise possible.